The North Korean attack turned the Cold War hot. In a limited proxy or brushfire war, distant rivals served as substitutes for the US and Soviets, who stood behind or beside them. In Korea, this stance was put to the test. At the close of World War II, the Soviets and Americans agreed to the temporary North-South division of Korea, a Japanese colony since the early 20th century. The US and Soviets agreed to divide Korea into occupation zones at the 38th parallel. Northern Korea had strategic importance for the Soviets, who considered the peninsula key to blocking future Japanese influence in the region and a counterweight to continued US occupation of Japan. Between 1945 and 1950, the Soviets sponsored the creation in the north of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea under Kim Il-sung. The United States backed a separate government in the south, the Republic of Korea, headed by the conservative nationalist Syngman Rhee, who had lived in the U.S. for decades. Both of these new states experienced political insecurity and violence, with an estimated 100,000 people killed during constant internal struggles. The rivalry between the North and South intensified throughout the late 1940s. Both shared much in common, despite their divergent political views. Repressive, autocratic leaders controlled both sections of divided Korea, and both were willing to use violence against their own people and expend massive resources on the military to prevent unification on any terms but their own. In a precedent-setting decision, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff concluded as early as 1947 that Korea had little strategic value to the U.S., but abandoning the unstable South Korean regime would almost certainly lead to war between the U.S.-supported South and the Soviet-supported North. By 1950, U.S. leaders had growing concerns that Communist China would join the fight as well. Under the logic of containment, this potential spread of communism was unacceptable, even if it meant supporting South Korea, a repressive, malfunctioning government in a country known to few Americans with no significant strategic value. On June 25, 1950, the Soviet-supplied North Korean army launched a large-scale invasion across the 38th parallel. The well-organized assault drove quickly through South Korea and into the capital city of Seoul, forcing the U.S.-backed government to flee.
On Sunday, June 25th, Communist forces attacked the Republic of Korea.
As the B-52s began to bomb North Korean positions in the south, it was clear that for the first time the Western Allies were on a collision course with the Communist bloc. The United Nations had passed a resolution condemning the North Korean attack as an act of aggression and called on them to withdraw to the 38th parallel. It was also clear that they were going to do no such thing. So the scene was set for a war between North and South, with the North supplied by China with tacit backing from the Soviet Union, and the South supported by the United States and its allies, and sanctioned by the United Nations. And that, for nearly 18 months, was how it transpired.
2 days after the invasion, the United Nations Security Council, with the Soviets absent so they could not veto the move, met and voted to authorize a U.S.-led coalition of forces to push the communists back across the 38th parallel. Truman named General Douglas MacArthur, chief of the American occupation force in Japan, as U.S. UN theater commander in Korea. From its onset, the Korean War tested not only U.S. Cold War foreign policy, but also the ability of the UN to create coalitions of supporters willing to fight for collective, rather than national goals. During the conflict, 17 UN member nations from 4 continents sent troops to Korea, but U.S. troops far outnumbered all other nations combined. After North Korean forces pushed coalition troops to a small foothold in South Korea, MacArthur staged a dramatic counterattack at Incheon on the northwestern coast of South Korea on September 15, 1950. Pushing rapidly across the peninsula and liberated Seoul, U.S. and UN troops drove hundreds of thousands of North Korean troops north and won back the south in one sustained assault. This surprisingly easy victory inspired both Truman and MacArthur to expand the war. Instead of simply restoring South Korea, the U.S. announced a new goal, destroying the North Korean regime and unifying the country under Rhee. In just a few weeks, the coalition reached the northern capital of Pyongyang and seemed poised to retake the entire country. In the flush of apparent victory, both Truman and MacArthur ignored Chinese warnings that its forces would intervene to defend North Korea, especially if U.S. troops approached the Yalu River that separated Korea from China's industrial heartland in Manchuria. MacArthur's forceful personality convinced Truman that China was bluffing and that both the president and general would share in the glory of rolling back communism. When 250,000 Chinese troops swarmed across the border and quickly pushed the U.S. all the way back to the 38th parallel, that assumption was dramatically proved wrong. With U.S. troops in retreat, MacArthur and Truman accused each other of incompetence and political posturing. In April 1951, Truman fired MacArthur for insubordination. The 38th parallel was the focal point of 3 more years of protracted and bloody fighting with no decisive objective other than holding the line. The Demilitarized Zone, otherwise known as the DMZ or No Man's Land splitting Korea at the 38th parallel, became a Cold War icon, a symbol of stalemate and a persistent reminder that proxy wars could lead to seemingly infinite conflict.